The sinkhole made the news by noon, and by evening it had become something else entirely. It started as a story about a water main rupture, which was unusual but not unheard of in a city the size of Zoa City. Streets got repaired. Things got fixed. People moved on. But somewhere between the first photographs and the evening coverage, the story shifted. Someone had talked. Not maliciously, not with any agenda, just the ordinary human inability to sit on something significant when people around you are asking questions. A word here, a detail there, and by the time Rourke's office started fielding calls, the narrative had already formed its own shape. People weren't just asking about the sinkhole anymore. They were asking about the water. Marcus felt it the next morning the moment he walked into the operations center. The energy in the room was different. The team was the same, the screens were the same, the work was the same, but something had tightened in the air. Everyone was doing their job with the specific focused quietness of people who knew they were now being watched from above. Rourke called at 8 a.m. The council wanted a full briefing by end of day. 3 council members had already received calls from district representatives asking what was happening beneath their neighborhoods. One had received a call from a hospital administrator who had heard rumors and wanted assurances about water continuity. Marcus told Rourke he would have the briefing ready. Then he asked Rourke to give him the morning without interruption because he had a more immediate problem than the council's questions. The Northwest Quadrant. He pulled up the geological survey data for that part of the city and spread it across 2 screens. The Northwest Quadrant was the oldest continuously inhabited section of Zoa City, built in phases over decades before the city had the kind of unified planning and construction standards it operated under now. The buildings there were older, shorter, built close together, their foundations varying wildly depending on when and how each block had been developed. Some sat on solid bedrock. Some sat on compacted fill. Some sat on ground that had been built over, dug up, built over again, the soil composition underneath them a layered history of construction decisions made by people who had no idea what would eventually be built on top of their work. The 3 remaining critical joints ran directly beneath all of it. The approach that had carried the operation through its first 9 sections relied on a consistent understanding of what the ground would do when you opened it up and started working. How it would respond to the pressure rerouting. How the surrounding soil would behave when the pipe sections were cut and replaced. That consistency had held across the first 9 sections because that part of the corridor ran beneath newer districts where the ground composition was mapped and predictable. The Northwest Quadrant was neither of those things. Thomas knocked on the glass of Marcus's office at 9 a.m. and came in without waiting. He had been underground that morning doing preliminary ground scans in the first block of the Northwest section, and his expression carried the specific flatness that Marcus had come to recognize as Thomas's version of serious concern. Thomas put his tablet on the desk and showed Marcus the scan results. The ground beneath the first Northwest block was not what either of them had hoped. Between the surface and the pipe depth there were 3 distinct layers of inconsistent fill material sitting alongside a section of what appeared to be older infrastructure, unmapped, possibly a remnant of a previous construction phase that had never been properly documented. The fill layers meant the ground would not respond predictably to excavation pressure. The unmapped structure meant they could not guarantee what was sharing space with the pipes they needed to reach. Marcus looked at the scans for a long time. Then he looked at the corridor map. 3 joints. 3 blocks. The deepest fractures in the entire corridor sitting inside pipe walls running through ground that did not want to cooperate. He asked Thomas what he thought the approach needed to be. Thomas said slower. Significantly slower. Smaller excavation windows, lower pressure differentials during the switching sequences, more frequent stops to rescan the ground conditions as they progressed rather than working from a fixed model. The kind of operation where you made decisions 10 meters at a time instead of 10 sections at a time. Marcus asked how much longer that added to the timeline. Thomas said at minimum an additional 2 weeks. The briefing with the council that afternoon was the most uncomfortable hour Marcus had spent since the first time he walked into that building uninvited. Rourke led it, but the questions came from everywhere around the table and they had a different quality now than they had in the earlier meetings. Before, the council had been weighing risk against reputation. Now the reputation was already compromised and the risk had a sinkhole and a photograph attached to it. The questions were sharper. The patience was thinner. One council member asked Marcus directly whether the rupture at Section 9 was a failure of the operation or a failure of the planning. Marcus said it was a fracture that the standard scanning equipment had not detected because it was below the resolution threshold of the acoustic sensors they were using. He said they had adjusted the scanning protocol for all remaining sections to use higher resolution equipment that would catch fractures at that scale. He said it would not happen again in the same way. The council member asked if Marcus was certain of that. Marcus said he was certain they had addressed the specific failure point. He was not going to tell a room full of people that certainty was something you got to keep in an operation like this one, because it wasn't and they all knew it. Rourke moved the briefing forward before the silence became its own answer. The additional 2-week timeline extension was approved without enthusiasm. The council authorized a limited public statement acknowledging infrastructure maintenance work in the affected districts, carefully worded, technically accurate, and as close to the full truth as a carefully worded statement ever gets. They began the northwest section on a Tuesday morning at 3 a.m. Thomas's crew worked differently here from the first day. Slower, more deliberate, stopping every few meters to rescan before moving forward, treating the ground beneath them as something that needed to be understood rather than simply moved through. The higher resolution acoustic scanners added time to every step, but they also added something the operation had been running without enough of since Section 9. Confidence. The first joint in the northwest section took 3 days to reach and replace. Under normal conditions, with predictable ground, it would have taken 18 hours. But it was done cleanly, the pressure sequencing held, and when Thomas's crew sealed the new joint and restored flow, the readings came back exactly where they needed to be. 1 joint down. 2 remaining. Marcus allowed himself a single quiet moment of something close to relief and then moved on because the second joint was the one that had been keeping him up at night since Thomas had first shown him the ground scans. It sat beneath the oldest block in the entire quadrant. A residential block, 4- and 5-story buildings packed tightly together, some of them showing the kind of age that expressed itself in settled foundations and walls that had learned to lean slightly into whatever the ground beneath them had decided to do over the decades. The ground scan for that block had come back with the most inconsistent composition of anywhere in the corridor. Pockets of soft fill sitting directly alongside harder material, the kind of ground that behaved differently depending on exactly where you put pressure and exactly how much. And beneath all of it, at pipe depth, the second joint. The fractures in its walls measuring at the deepest point in the entire 40-kilometer corridor. Thomas came to Marcus the evening before they were scheduled to begin that block and told him he wanted to add an additional scanning phase before they opened anything. A full ground-penetrating radar sweep of the entire block, not just the immediate pipe path, to map every anomaly in the soil composition before they committed to the excavation sequence. It would add another day. Marcus approved it without hesitation. The radar sweep took most of the following day, and when the results came back that evening, Marcus and Thomas sat together and went through them in silence for a long time. The news was not good and it was not catastrophic. It was the specific kind of in-between that required judgment rather than procedure. The ground beneath the second joint block was as inconsistent as the scans had suggested, but the radar had found something additionally concerning. A pocket of loose fill material sitting approximately 3 meters to the side of the pipe path, large enough that aggressive excavation pressure in the wrong direction could destabilize it. If that pocket shifted during the operation, it would not threaten the pipe work directly. It would threaten the foundation of the building sitting above it. Not collapse. Nothing that dramatic. But enough movement to crack foundations, compromise structural integrity, make a building that was already old feel the difference between the ground it had settled into over decades and the ground that had just been disturbed beneath it. Marcus looked at the building above that pocket on the survey map. A residential building. Occupied. He looked at Thomas. Thomas said they could route around the pocket with a modified excavation approach. It would require going in at a different angle, using a smaller equipment profile, and accepting that the work on that specific section would be painstakingly slow. He said his crew could do it. He said it would take 4 days for a section that would otherwise take 1. Marcus said do it. Outside the operations center that evening, the city was doing what it always did. Moving, eating, sleeping, turning taps and expecting water to come out. The public statement had quieted most of the louder questions, but not all of them. In the northwest quadrant specifically, residents had noticed the increased crew presence, the closed-off streets, the equipment moving in and out at unusual hours. People knocked on the temporary barriers and asked the workers what was happening. The workers told them infrastructure maintenance and kept working. It was true. It was also the smallest version of the truth. Marcus drove home that night through the northwest quadrant, taking a longer route than he needed to, moving slowly through the narrow older streets with the residential buildings close on either side. Lights on in windows. People inside living their evenings. He looked at those buildings and thought about what was beneath them and what his team was doing down there in the dark, and how none of the people in those lit windows had any idea how close the ground under their city had come to giving them a very different kind of evening. He drove home. He slept 4 hours. He went back. 2 joints completed. 1 remaining. The last one sat at the far end of the northwest quadrant where the corridor finally ended and where the fractures in the pipe wall were, by the numbers, the worst of anything they had found in 40 kilometers of damaged infrastructure. Marcus had been saving it. Not avoiding it. Saving it. Because everything the team had learned across 5 weeks of working through this corridor, every adjustment and lesson and hard-earned instinct, was going to be needed for what came last.